Now, one of the questions you may be asking yourself is, in light of the strategic crisis in Ukraine, in light of the human crisis in Syria, how can I call even this profound jobless challenge a crisis? I submit to you that it is a profound crisis of our economic system, an economic system that cannot provide meaningful, remunerative employment to its people is an economic system that is failing its citizens. And we profoundly are failing our citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. We worry about it in part because it's a political crisis. We all worry about the political consequences of continued high unemployment. But I suggest to you it's also a moral crisis because we have a moral responsibility to our people to enable them to control their lives through having a job, having the psychological stability of contributing to their families, to their own future, to the success of their society. And again, we have failed these people, and we are failing them profoundly, and we are failing them in a way we have not failed them since the Great Depression. So I do think that in terms of the challenges we face on both sides of the Atlantic, this is a very important discussion we're about to have. And I would like to welcome our panelists to talk about this. We have Carolyn Atkinson, who is the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics. She is the President's Sherpa on these vital economic issues. We have Jim Clifton, who's the Chairman and CEO of Gallup. We have Carlos Moedas, who is the State Secretary in the Prime Minister's office in Portugal, on the front lines on some of these issues in his own country. And we have Wilfried Porth, member of the Board of Management of Daimler, one of the major sponsors of the GMF Forum for many years, but more importantly, in this role, a company that is actually trying to deal with these issues in the company setting where obviously a lot of the work has to be done. Before we start this, I want to ask all of you a question. There is a debate, a broad debate about what is the cause, what is the challenge we face? Is it a demand side challenge of we just need to find some way to create more jobs? We aren't doing a good enough job doing that. Or is the challenge a supply side one, that we are not training people, giving them the skills and the education they need so they aren't employable? And if we can go to the survey, the first survey question, if we have it up there. Yes. We just lost it. If we could get it back, that'd be good. There, great. What I would like you to do is go to your app and vote. We're going to see how this plays out through the conversation. One is the job problem a question of a need for greater growth that will create a demand for more jobs, or a need for a more skilled workforce that will then stimulate employment? You have 15 seconds to vote. So if we could start now and you could cast your vote, that would be great. And the winner is, it would appear that nearly 6 in 10 of you believe it's a demand side problem, not a supply side problem. But there's a significant minority who believe it's a supply side problem. We'll return to this issue throughout the conversation and at the end. So if we could start with Caroline, a question for you. In the last 3 years, the U.S. economy has created about 8.5 million jobs, according to the President's most recent economic report. And yet we still have 10.5 million people who are out of work. Doesn't that suggest to you 5 years on since the advent of the Great Recession, that we really just do not know how to get the workforce working again? That we've tried a number of different things in the United States, but this track record is not a commentary on necessarily the Obama administration, but we just don't know how to do this.
No, I don't agree with that. I think that That 8.5 million shows you that there has been a steady increase in employment. That's a figure for the private sector. For the last many quarters, the private sector has been adding jobs. We have more and more evidence that there is a recovery underway in the United States. It is not fast enough yet. We have a long way further to go. We still have much too high unemployment, especially long-term unemployment. But we do know that the trajectory is the right one. And I think that is a result of some of the policies that have been put in place and the gradual healing that has been taking place after the recession. It's not nearly good enough, but we are not helpless.
Let me follow up on that. One insidious aspect of this unemployment, the existing continuing unemployment, is, as you mentioned, this rise in the number of long-term unemployed. We now have, in the United States, if I'm not wrong, more long-term unemployed than we've had at any time since the Great Depression. That means, in the U.S. parlance, people who have been out of work for more than 26 weeks, as I recall. Do we have to assume, given how difficult it's been to get them back into the workforce, and every week we don't get them back in the workforce, they have been unemployed for a longer period of time, that those people may never actually get full-time, meaningful employment again?
Again, America's the land of optimism and can do. And what I believe is that for those long-term unemployed, you need more than just a general recovery and a general rise. We need some specific policies which we've been proposing and advocating and putting in place that go to the employment of long-term unemployed. And this is somewhere where we need to work, the public sector needs to work with the private sector. We know that in your resume, if you put in for a job and there is only the difference, you have identical resumes, but in one, the period of unemployment is much longer than in the other, a business will choose the person with the shortest unemployment. And that's understandable, but we need to work against that. We need to work very deliberately with the private sector on supporting the return to employment of the longer-term unemployed. That's a very specific and very important problem to address.
Carlos, unemployment stands at 15% in Portugal. Now, compared to your neighbor Spain, that's good. And in fact, the unemployment rate in Portugal has come down about 2 percentage points in recent months. The Portuguese government has attempted some labor market reforms as a way to try to stimulate more hiring. Could you talk a little bit about what you've tried, but also share with us the difficulty of that, because obviously everybody talks about labor market reform, but doing it is another issue. And where did you fail? What would you like to have done, but you couldn't get done?
Yeah. Bruce, good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for the question and the opportunity to tell you a little bit here about the story of what's going on in Portugal in the past 2.5 years. And we've been through a lot of sacrifices during this period. But one of the things that it's important, and I think that I will try to convince the audience, is that when you answer that is basically a demand-side problem, I would argue that in Europe is a supply-side problem. And when you look at basically what we have done in Portugal in terms of the labor market and the reforms on the labor market, they were about the biggest problem in Europe in the labor market, which is basic dualism. You have the typical problem of insiders versus outsiders. You have young people that do not have any protection, very weak contracts, and you have the older people with better contracts and better protection. So when, Bruce, you asked me what we did, we actually had 2 ways to go about it. One was to break it and let's do a one single contract to everybody. But there was no track record in Europe or in other countries that works. And so our approach was more a step-by-step approach. How can I actually get and equalize these 2 types of contracts so I get people back to work with the same conditions and the same opportunities. And so that was the work that was done in 2.5 years with the unions. And let's face it, that because we decided to go step by step, we could have the unions with us. And we looked at what are the major differences. I mean, severance payments are very different from the temporary contracts to the permanent contracts. So let's equalize those two. What's the difference in between myself being able to dismiss someone on a permanent contract or a temporary contract? And let's try to equalize that. And by doing that, I think that you're really changing the bone, and you're not breaking it, and you have the unions with you, which in Portugal was crucial in these very difficult times.
Thank you. Wilfried, Gallup recently did a survey that showed that 59% of workers said they acquired the skills that they're using, not in school, but in work. That would seem to argue that what we need is better training in the workplace and apprenticeships to get people into work where they could learn those skills. Daimler has been in the forefront on many of these issues, both in Germany and some of its plants abroad. Could you talk a little bit about how you do that, and then how does it relate to the broader German experience, which we all know has been fairly forward-leaning on some of these issues in the past?
Yeah, first, companies on long term are only successful if their products are successful. So the big question is, how can you create interesting products where customers are prepared to pay for on long term? So short term political interventions might help a little bit, but in long term they are not really helping to support the success of the companies. So we are very much convinced that good products can only come from very good and well qualified people. That is not only a Daimler belief, it's a German belief, I would say so. And what we are having is we have those apprenticeships for young people where they really get a very profound education. And the big difference between somebody who is trained and somebody who is qualified through apprenticeship is the problem-solving capabilities. They are really able to solve problems across functions, across divisions, across business units, across products. And that is our big benefit. Now, the big hurdle we always have to jump over when we bring that to foreign countries is that there is no society base, or there's no real base there, first to accept the formal achievements, you know. And the people are not really prepared to take that. So we always fight this with the governments there to accept this formal graduation. We always have to talk to those people that they cannot earn the money from the very beginning they expect, because they have to invest in themselves in the beginning. We are investing in them. So it's a mix of our company philosophy and what we find in the different countries in order to develop that further on.
Jim Clifton. Gallup just published a study called The State of the Global Workforce. What from that study do you think gives us some insight as to what, not just what has to be done, but what can be successful in terms of dealing with getting people back to work?
I'm going to answer a question that you didn't ask, first of all.
Like a good politician, you know.
You gotta be
She did admit it.
You have to be very careful about the word unemployment. It's getting so messy because the denominator is always changing. So we reported that the unemployment's the best it's been at 6.7. 580,000 people dropped out of the workforce with that 500. So I don't want to use the word dishonest. I'm going to use the word cruel. But the unemployment number in the United States is a cruel number. The best number to use is the number of people that have a full-time job compared to the population. Because what people really want is a full-time job. So if you clean out the messiness of part-time, informal, all that kind of stuff, just cut to the chase. How many people have a full-time job compared to adult population? The answer in the United States is 42%. It's the lowest it's been in 40 years. Our Our employment situation is the worst it's been in 40 years, and it will get worse in 2014. I bet all my Gallup stock on it. It will get worse. So what we did is, because now the ILO, God bless all of you from the ILO and the OECD, but everybody sends in their own unemployment numbers. And so everybody kind of goes by, they're supposed to go by the same rules, but they don't. But if you go around the world and ask for full-time to population, then you have the real energy of a workforce. So we did this in 160 countries. It gets you 98% of the population. There's 7 billion people, 5 billion adults, and of the 5 billion, 3 billion of them said, we really wish we had a full-time job. That's the will of the world, is to have a full-time job. 1.2 billion of them have a real job. So you could argue that there's over 50% unemployment in the world. Now remember, I'm sorry about this, but ILO and OECD and everybody, all your governments, you can be selling gum in traffic and you'll call them employed. And if you go and ask them, what do you wish you had? They wish they had a full-time, they wish they had a real job, so clean that out. But that number is sinking a little bit. And so with productivity, when you talk about supply and demand, where are we going to get our next growth? That's probably, I don't mean to sound too breathless, but human development probably lies within the productivity of that 1.2 billion people that have a real job. I'll get this over with. We asked the 1.2, how many of them kind of love their job, feel that their life has meaning because they're in a job, they're developing and all that. That's only about 12 to 13%. We're not doing a very good job. So all of us went to business school and all that. It's not working. So there's only about 150 million people in the world that kind of cook up everything, create good customers, get ideas, spin off, start new companies, build new cars, and do all of that kind of thing. But that's the state of the global workplace.
No, and that, it seems to me, is the real challenge, is that it's not just creating a job, any job, it's basically also creating full-time jobs and meaningful jobs, ones that are fulfilling to people, because at the end of the day, it's not that people just want an income. Of course they want an income, but they'd like to feel that they're contributing, that their human resources are being fully utilized. And you actually, it seems to me, hinted at it, an even a more profound issue, is that what economists see as productivity, from a working point of view, it means that we can produce as much with fewer people. And so how do we get those people into the workforce when, in fact, you go into a modern factory today and there are virtually no people, if it's a globally competitive factory. And so we do face, I think, that broader challenge, which goes beyond this panel, of the nature of work going forward. I'd like to turn to Joe Echevarria. I could ask you a question. Deloitte recently published a survey of about 2,500 firms. And what struck me about that was that while workforce capability and training was an important issue for the people you surveyed, the number one most urgent priority was leadership. Now that's a bit of an intangible issue. You don't just kind of prescribe leadership, you don't pass a leadership initiative in Congress. What is your sense of, if we need better leadership to get out of this joblessness challenge, how do you cultivate that? How do you stimulate that? How do you get that going, if that's going to be one of the answers?
Waiting for my microphone. Leadership is getting somebody to believe in you. So you have to start with that premise. It's not some grand title that you're given. Someone has to believe in you. And I think the gentleman right here first talked about the experiences that you get as an apprenticeship versus someone who's just been trained. That distinguishment is leadership in of itself. So I wouldn't confuse leadership with big titles, muckety-muck jobs, nothing like that. Basic skills that people want to follow you. Because without that, it's hard to move the needle on anything. And in the country that I'm from, United States, Washington, D.C., I think Senator Menendez was here before. We are certainly lacking in leadership in Washington. And if we don't get a couple of basic things done, some of the suggestions of running the Gallup poll and the long-term unemployment will just continue. They'll just continue. They're not going to get any better. It'll be on the burden of the private sector. And the gap you have in the United States, if you think about the fact that we have 600,000 manufacturing jobs to fill, that cannot be filled, half of those require STEM. And we tell most of our girls when they're coming up, they're not going to be good at science and math. And we just start a problem of not being able to fill STEM. So to that first question, we could move the needle along if we just did something simple like that.
An anecdote, I recently went back to my high school in western Pennsylvania, which fortunately still has a steel mill. Not many towns in Pennsylvania still have steel mills. They still have a manufacturing base. In my high school, you can major in different things. Even though you could leave that high school and get a manufacturing job that paid with overtime maybe $60,000 a year, there were more kids studying to be beauticians than there were studying to go into manufacturing. That is a leadership issue because someone has to convince those kids that they have a future, not going to college and not becoming a beautician, but actually doing jobs which no longer get their hands dirty. And I mean, that's the other challenge. We're going to throw this open to the audience now. If you could identify yourself, if you could ask a specific question to a specific panelist, that would help so people don't feel the need to answer all questions. Right here.
My name is Hari Haran, and this is a question for Caroline Atkinson.
You're from where?
I'm sorry, I run a fund in New York called NWI.
Okay.
One of the bewildering issues here is that with cost of capital virtually close to zero, interest rates in the US, in the West, are virtually at floor levels. How do we explain this basic question as to why smart American and European corporations do not find attractive enough investment opportunities with an IRR which predictably could now be extremely low? What are we missing? Because if the poll is correct and aggregate demand is what is going to create jobs, I don't see how aggregate demand is going to come from anything other than investment. What is holding investment back with interest rates where they are?
Great question. Caroline.
That is a great question, and I was interested in the poll showing how many people felt that there was a shortage of demand, which I agree with. I think that's more striking in Europe than as it is in the United States. I believe that as this recovery moves forward slowly, as I said, it is definitely moving. We expect growth this year to be somewhat stronger than last year. We had a big headwind against expansion from the fiscal consolidation that was occurring. That will not be the same this year. And I believe that gradually, not as quickly as we would like, businesses will start to invest. And as you know, and many people here know better than I do, business will invest only if they think they can sell whatever it is that they're investing to produce. So it's not just about the cost of capital, it's also about the estimate of the market. What we need to be showing is that there will be a market for those goods, so it is worth making that investment.
Next question back here.
Thank you. My question relates to confidence, and I think the unreasonable macroeconomic policy we have been following before the crisis, and which we are continuing to follow in advanced economies, with huge uncertainty on fiscal consolidation, on movement of capital flow, on tapering, and all this liquidity that is around. It generates uncertainty, and that leads back to what the gentleman said on investment. Everybody is holding back his options, waiting to see how it's going to evolve. So there's a structural component to this crisis beyond the deficiency in demand that the Fed has been doing a lot to compensate with a huge monetary stimulus, and it's not really happening. The same situation goes in Europe. So how, and the process that you guys had within the G20, is now not really working. So if you add all that to Ukraine and all that stuff, if I had cash, I would sit on it. Why should I invest? Maybe I'll go to Africa where there are interesting returns. And this is again not happening because the World Bank and all these guys are not capable on pushing the button and de-risking investment and for this to allow. So there is something wrong in the cooperation mechanism, the multilateralism at the IMF, and we didn't. So and that's a question for Caroline Atkinson, is this something you perceive, or it is something that it's not in your agenda at all? And is it, if yes, what are you doing to correct that? Because it's not reassuring.
Okay, so, I mean, this is what Paul Krugman, in a more negative sense, would call the confidence fairy, right? It's been an issue that's been raised for years now. Clearly, there is a lack of confidence, or people would, in theory, be investing more, but it's not at all clear what can be done 5 years on to increase confidence. So maybe, Carlos, you can start and then we'll, yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that you are asking Caroline, but I thought that your question is so interesting because you have here more the two sides of the world, if I may say, the United States and the problem of Europe. And when you look at European countries that for the last 10, 15 years have been spending money for 10 years and absolutely creating no growth, so you actually have a problem that is not about spending, is not about demand. There's something else, as you said, that is structural. And the structural side in Europe is about how can you actually create this single market without barriers. Because you have created in Europe a market that had no barriers for credit, and flows of debt were all around Europe, but there's still barriers in terms of equity. Cross-border transactions are very low in Europe. And my point is that that's all about how you can lower down barriers to business people and to companies. And that's where you get into the labor reform and to the product market reform. How can you have free transactions without barriers? And that's something that, unfortunately, we have a lot to do still in Europe. I'm not going to talk about the case of the United States, but in my own continent, I think that, and Governor of the Central Bank, President Draghi, normally says that we have all the tools to actually look at the fiscal consolidation, look what countries are doing, but we don't have the tools to oblige countries to do the structural reforms. So you create these negative externalities in between these countries in Europe that are negative for the creation of jobs and for the confidence. Sorry, Caroline.
Caroline?
Certainly, confidence is important, but it is also, I share some of Paul Krugman's doubt about a confidence fairy. I believe that business and private capital is smart enough to find opportunities and exploit those opportunities when they're there. But they need to see the opportunity, they need to see the ability to sell and make a profit. I don't agree, if I may, with the analysis of the difficulty in Europe. There were some countries that certainly borrowed and spent too much. Eurozone as a whole had a rather modest debt to GDP ratio. The problem was imbalances within the euro that were not financed in an easy way. And the response was to have very sharp fiscal consolidation in some countries that could no longer borrow, with no offsetting increase in demand in other countries. So the Eurozone as a whole is not yet back to the level of output that it was before the crisis. In the United States, we are back and above that, but still not been recovering rapidly enough to provide that assurance that you will have a market for your goods.
Jim Clifton, one of the issues in the U.S. beyond investor confidence is consumer confidence. That as modestly well as or relatively well as the U.S. economy is doing compared to how it did or how Europe is doing, you don't see a real strong revival in consumer confidence. And do you have any sense of what's lacking in terms of reviving consumer confidence?
Let me go up just one tick from consumer to small business. So there's 6 million businesses in America. You'll read 26 or 28, there's not. There's 6 million. There's 20 million that are businesses on paper, and I don't know why people say 26 or 28. Of the 6 million, 4 million of them have only 1 to 4 employees, 1.4. They're mom and pop shops. So there's only 2 million businesses, only 1,000 in the big category of 10,000. There's really very few small, big businesses in America. I mean, you hear Walmart and all those big, it tails off real fast. So there's an ecosystem that the whole country rides on of only about 2 million. I'm going to call them small and medium sized. That's where all the jobs are and everything is. When we polled them, we asked them, why aren't you sticking your neck out? Why don't you hire new salesmen? Why don't you have a new ad campaign and all that kind of thing? And what they say is, because remember, they're stopped. These are turtles with their heads and tails. Everything's tucked in. They look like a rock on the highway. And we say, why are you like that? And the first word out of their mouth is regulations. We say, really, which ones? And the first one out of their mouth is health care. And we say, what is it about health care? And they say, we don't know, we just know it's bad. Second one they say is environment. Whether you like it or not, I'm just telling you what they say, what other side of it. And about a third of them have something to do with construction. And so this is where you find the spirit of free enterprise or confidence, and I think it's everything. And to think that America's recovering, you're hallucinating. So we say, what's happening
As a child of the 60s, I'm always hallucinating, but anyway.
But they get letters in the mail that say you can't use this paintbrush anymore, you can't use a steel bucket, you got to use a rubber bucket and all that, and they go, oh my gosh, they just stop. So confidence right there is killing growth. And our growth is, I think it was 1.9, it's supposed to be 3. Economists, they're worse than weathermen, they overshoot. They're always hoping for the biggest storm, 3%. Then it comes in at 1.9, now we're going to adjust it down maybe to 1.6. But here's the other place where confidence just crushes us, and it's crushing Europe too. So that ecosystem of 2 million businesses that we live off, we tax it and get jobs and everything else, is built by 500,000 new businesses starting each year and 400,000 that close and die. So we live off of a net of 100,000. If we had a herd of cattle, 100 cows die and 400,000 cows die, 500,000 new calves. It works. Herd keeps growing. 3 years ago, those lines crossed. By the way, this is from the U.S. Census Bureau. It's not a poll. It has the error range is 0. They get them all. They crossed. So now we only have 400,000 starting and 500,000 dying. And so our ecosystem, we're like the rainforest. The trees are dying faster than they're growing. And of course, that all comes back to confidence. But the spirit of free enterprise, I overlaps with, they're the same thing. But that thing is definitely injured.
Wilfried, I mean, this gets back to the issue of that Mittelstand and
maybe I can jump in. Maybe
right. That's what I was just saying.
It would be quite interesting.
There's a lot of capital out there in the business community. Why is it not being invested? You have a sense of that?
Yeah, maybe it would be interesting to have an opinion from somebody who is deciding on real investments and not only on framework.
Yeah.
And I think it's far too short to say the financial crisis and uncertainty whatsoever. What we need to realize is that since years, I would say since a decade, there's a huge shift taking place where manufacturing jobs are moving from Europe to Asia. And when you look at the UK, and you look at France, this structural change is tremendous. But there was no addressing of the change by attracting other industries or preparing the people for those other jobs. And that's a huge issue. And you cannot really heal that with putting more money into the system. You need structural changes in general. And even in the US, also ourselves, we are the owner of Freightliner. Yeah, we are moving manufacturing jobs to Mexico. Why? Less cost, more flexible. And we need to look at those kind of frameworks. And if those kind of things are not changing, we will not really go back into investments in our traditional locations. We are investing a lot in Germany, but we are investing basically in existing locations. But we are not increasing our existing locations because of all those hindering framework conditions. And this is where we need to be very careful. It's not the financial crisis alone. There's a thing which has been started 10 years, maybe 15 years ago, and it's ongoing, and it's actually increasing.
Great. So over here we had a question, right here.
Paweł Szwyboda, Demos Europa in Warsaw. I have a question especially for Carlos and Wilfried. Because in Europe we used to speak about 4 different socioeconomic models. The Sapir report 10 years ago, continental, Anglo-Saxon, Nordic and Mediterranean. And the assumption was that there are cultural characteristics which we cannot overcome, so we should not aim at harmonizing the socioeconomic models. We should accept the diversity but learn from each other. Now, are we in a different situation now after the crisis, with the German labor market reforms being so much of a reference point? I mean, you have Professor Hertz, the author of the reports, being invited to the Élysée to advise President Hollande. Very meaningful situation. And isn't that, if this is the case, that we are building more of a common denominator, isn't that making things more difficult for you in the South, where you have very specific problems? Some of them you referred to, the product market reforms, also shifting taxation from labor to consumption, which would translate into a significant boost of employment. So isn't that making life more difficult for you?
Carlos, you want to?
I can start that one. Look, I don't believe in the theory that this is about cultural differences. I was very young when I left my country at the age of 23, and I spent 14 years outside in the United States, in different countries in Europe. And I don't believe that. I think that exactly it's something that we have to see as the past. I mean, this is not about cultural differences. This is about countries in Europe and about doing the right reforms in your economy to create jobs. And so when you look, and Caroline was rightly saying about the imbalances in the different countries of Europe, there's no reason today for a country in the South to not be as productive as a country in the North if you do the right reforms to have the right incentives. People respond to incentives, and the incentive in the South for a long time was about spending and not doing the reforms. So you had this bubble of public expenditure that went on, and suddenly you were not competitive anymore. So the point of creating a union in Europe where actually you can live with these differences is about getting these barriers out of the way so you can live in a Europe where you don't have 28 different labor markets. You have to have one European labor market. And for that, the rules have to be kind of similar. If not, it doesn't work. For people to look to our continent and say, look, actually, on average, it looks good, as Caroline was saying, it has to be looking good, and I can have to have mobility in between the countries. I have to go around, and I have to create this new generation that is very different from the former one. One of the major successes of Europe in these past 15, 20 years was something very simple, because sometimes reforms are very simple. It was called Erasmus program. In my generation, there was absolutely very rare. There was very few people from countries in the South that will travel and live in the North. I mean, the Erasmus program has created a new generation of people that actually don't look at anymore to the borders as they did before. And so if you can actually step by step destroy these barriers to level the playing field, you will not talk about this dichotomy in between the North and the South in the next 10, 20 years. At least that's my hope.
Carlos, you mentioned the next generation. One of the issues we haven't talked about maybe enough here is the high rate of youth unemployment, especially in Southern Europe. But it's also a problem in the United States. And there is at least a fear, maybe it's not well-grounded, that we could lose a whole generation of people. That we could have a whole generation of people who in their 40s and 50s have never held a a full-time job, haven't learned not only how to support themselves, but haven't learned work habits. The discipline that comes with work, which we all hate when we're 18, but we realize when we're older that it was actually probably a useful thing to learn. You've talked about this bifurcated system in Portugal and trying to get rid of that. But is there more that can be done or should be done? Do we have any other lessons we can learn from other places in Daimler? I mean, are there things that you have done to try to emphasize hiring younger people? I mean, how do we address this youth unemployment problem, or frankly, do we not have a clue how to do that?
It's very different across the countries in Europe, and this is why in Germany we rather have a problem to get enough young people hired for apprenticeships because there are so many other options. And for some smaller companies, there's already today a big problem to get enough young people in their apprenticeship programs. Now, I know that there's a lot of calls around Europe that we should hire more Spanish and Portuguese and Italian people and bring them to Germany, and I think that's the wrong way around, because we have this experience from Western and Eastern Germany, where Eastern Germany, in a lot of areas, there's nobody living anymore but the old people. Industry has gone, companies have gone, so we rather need to invest in the countries. So, for example, we have a factory in Portugal, we have a factory in Spain, and we need to increase our apprenticeship programs there in order to support the society. But we should not, take all the young people out of those countries, because they are the future of the country, and they need to create a market, they need to create new initiatives, business initiatives, and we need to be very careful to call them out.
Caroline, in the US, when we had either a very successful Clinton economy at the end of the Clinton term, or you could call it a bubble economy, depending on how you define why we were doing so well, nevertheless, youth unemployment, and especially unemployment among young African Americans, was at a record low. So we do know how to address this problem if we can juice up the economy enough. But assuming either we can't get back there or it would be too dangerous to go the full way back there, how do we get young people into the workforce?
I think we have a lot of lessons to learn also from Europe and from Germany. And as you know, we've been looking at how you can, obviously STEM education, but also how you can look at apprenticeships. I think those are very important steps to be working towards and looking at. I would just like to say that in the Clinton years, of course, there was not a big fiscal deficit. We're moving into a surplus, and I don't think there was a bubble economy then. It developed later. And it does, that low level of unemployment, including amongst the most vulnerable, shows how important the overall level of demand is. I think within that, we have specific problems within the unemployment level now. We have specific problems of the long-term unemployed, youth unemployed, and the less well-trained.
Back here, question.
Yes, my name is İlter Turan from Istanbul Bilgi University. It seems that we're talking about two different types of unemployment. One of them that can be directly traced to the bad economic conditions that happen to prevail at the moment. And then a more structural one, where actually the way the productive enterprise is organized and the way we educate people and build up expectations in them do not correspond to the way the productive enterprise functions. So this is more of a problem. And my question is, apparently we're doing something wrong with the educational system. And essentially, what kind of changes do we need in the educational system to sort of bring the needs and the expectations a bit more together?
Joe, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I agree 100%, and I think that's why it's more of a public-private partnership, because if you think about what the jobs of the future are versus the traditional training that we take today, they're not aligned whatsoever. Not from the time someone enters elementary school, which would be, primary school here, to the time they graduate. It's still a select process. The menu looks the same, the choices look the same, the university programs look the same. And we need to steer people and children in certain directions. And it doesn't happen today. We have education completely disparate from business, from the geographies that we deploy people. We hire 18,000 people a year in our firm in certain capacities. Certain capacities. So I think you're right. I think that is a structural problem that needs to be addressed. And I know in the current administration, Obama, they're trying to, but that's a hard one. That's a hard one to do. But if it doesn't get done, those long-term unemployment numbers, the cruel that you referred to, the 2-point, they're going to just get higher. Not going to get lower because those individuals cannot be placed. They don't have the job of the future. So I'm 100% aligned with that.
Here in front.
John Richardson from a German Marshall Fund. I'd like to pick up what Wilfried Porth said about the pressure on manufacturing in Europe and its possible shift to the rest of the world. EU growth policy seems to me to have concentrated and to still be concentrating on expanding the knowledge base and improving the work skills of those who work in manufacturing industry. And I will have a question for Carlos Moedas. We have a very large sector in Europe which has production assets which nobody else has. It's the great density of tourist destinations that we have per square kilometer in Europe. That's something where others cannot compete on that same basis at all. And it happens to be a sector which produces very, very many jobs. It's not affected by losing jobs through productivity gains. It creates very many jobs throughout the European regions. Do you think that the European Union growth policy should be devoting more attention to tourism, bringing in high-spending tourists from outside of the European Union? And wouldn't that help in a country like yours?
It's a very good question because it seems to go to our conceits about what is a good job and what's not a good job. Now, I would challenge my good friend John that I'm not at all sure that there's a lot of value added in some of these tourist jobs, but they are jobs. So I'm curious, is the growth mix in Europe right? Or does it need to shift in terms of being able to generate more jobs?
It's a very good question, and especially for a country like Portugal, that one of our major industries is actually tourism. It's basically more than 10% of our GDP. When I look at actually the sector and I look at what should be done, I actually looked at the productivity and what's the productivity of the industrial sector in Europe versus the services sector, because tourism is about the services sector. And one of the things that strikes me is that if you look at the numbers of productivity, the difference in between the US and Europe is a lot focused on lack of productivity on the services sector in Europe. And so one of the things that we've been very focused in Portugal is about how do you look at innovation, just not on the technology as people sometimes look at innovation, but on the innovation of services and innovation of processes. And so I'm not about what actually could be and resources that could come to Europe. My worry is about whatever I, as a member of government, can control, which is how can I get it better and more attractive for people to come. And just linking your question to the professor back there on how do we look at education, and tourism is a part of our education system, one of the things that we did was looking at other countries and see what are the countries that have low youth unemployment doing that we're not. And one of the things that we understood in the very early stages is that countries that are doing better is because they have this dual system where people work and they study. And the earliest you can start that, the better. So if you can start that by the age of 13, 14, that young kids can have these two experiences, then you really have an effect. And tourism is a very good example.
Carlos does raise an interesting point, that we have not applied the lessons from manufacturing in terms of improving productivity to the services sector to the extent that it would be humanly possible. We know in the US where hospitals, the ultimate service center, have applied Toyota management techniques. They have improved the productivity of the hospital and the profitability of the hospital and the efficiency of the hospital, and reduce the error rate and all sorts of other things. Error rate in this case is people don't die, so it's a terribly important thing. But when you talk to people about applying the Toyota management techniques to services, it's like, how can we do this? I mean, this is a totally different world. It's not a different world, it's management. And at the end of the day, it's a management failure that we haven't done it, because it's not the workers who have failed to do this. It is the fact that management hasn't applied these lessons in a services situation right here.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. My name is Paul Ortega. I'm coming from the Basque region in Spain. Very interesting topics and things, but I am a little bit surprised not to see, you didn't underline a lot, the link between employment and the investment, public and private, in science, technology, and innovation. If you see the figures in Germany, but in the countries of North Europe, and recently the investments in the United States, I think there's a clear connection, and according that this reflection about structural employment, in addition to education, I think there is a very clear link between the investment, private and public investment in science, technology, and innovation with employment. Please, I would like to have your opinions. Thank you very much.
Who wants to?
You know, you hear so much about innovation, you know, that let's put billions and billions and billions into innovation. You know, to fix this job thing, you've got to be open to the fact that we're just dead wrong about the role of innovation. And nobody in the right mind would say that. But we have put, I watch in Washington, tens of billions of dollars, and people stand back and they go, did any jobs come out of that? The answer is always zero. And the reason is that those innovations don't have any value until a customer is standing next to them. They're in the person in Washington, especially this administration, and Republicans. I mean, I'm not picking on anybody. They don't have any idea about that. They just keep thinking that you build innovation. So we have giant piles of innovation and no jobs, but it's getting pretty tiring watching it. Here's a point. It's the business model, not the innovation. That internet sat in DARPA in the Defense Department for years. Vint Cerf, you know, he got the packets to fly across the fiber optics. He had that thing sitting there until Al Gore came over. It's a nice story about, I'm the only guy in the world that tells a nice story about Al Gore. but Al Gore, I don't like him any better than you do, but Al Gore came over. He ought to get a Nobel Prize for this. If anybody's here in charge of it, that's what he should have gotten it for. But he went over and said he loved technology, and he threw it out into commerce. And then, you know, I don't know what, probably 100 trillion, I mean, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. But it was business models, not the innovation. And I've asked NASA, I've asked CDC and all of them, do you have innovation in your labs right now that just need business models? They all say they've got all kinds of innovation. But we've made the development of I'm going to call it intellectual development. We've made that so intentional. God, we are donuts. Europe is, United States, at creating great things, but no customers. But I don't think until we make it as until we make the early identification of unusual entrepreneurs as systematic as we do intellectual, I think we're just going to keep spending billions and billions and billions. The Saudis are a great experiment. They just build innovation cities. They got nothing. It's like the more they build, the fewer real jobs they have. That's a good experiment right there.
And I would add on to that the studies that have shown that of all the innovation that's done, over half of it is process innovation, not product innovation. And again, that's a management challenge. How do you take the process innovations, two guys working on the assembly line who come up with a better way to kind of make this product with fewer people? How do you kind of system-wide that and
most of the people that develop this stuff, this other guys, they don't go to college.
No, they don't go to college.
Larry Ellison, Jobs, and
the value of some of those, you know, shop floor entrepreneurs, basically, is they say, we can go make this better than the guy who's employing us, and they go off, and you want to create an environment in which they can start their own firms and be successful, and maybe fail and not then be penalized by a system, especially in Europe, where failure is a death knell. Yeah.
And one thing we should not forget, we have to invest in some areas where we are forced by regulations, not by the pure desire of innovation. And those investments in innovation, they are simply increasing cost for the customer. And when you look at all those CO2 regulations, we, as the automotive industry, we are spending more money there for less impact than you could do in other areas of our lives. And that is where, again, a lot of investment, but no additional jobs, but just increasing cost for the customer.
Caroline.
I just want to challenge that, because I think a lot of, we can have regulation as a boogie bear, but I think that everybody knows, and we can see right now, if we look at what's been happening in China, air quality there is terrible.
Not because of the cars.
That is because, well, actually, it's quite a lot
not because of our cars.
It's quite a lot because.
But your cars.
Actually, our cars are cleaning the air.
But without regulation, your cars would be more of the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Without regulation, your cars would be more of a problem. And without the sharing, and I think one of the most exciting things is that you and other car manufacturers have been able to innovate and find more effective ways to produce clean cars. We've also found that entrepreneurs have been able to innovate and discover ways of harnessing other parts of other energies. And that is something that, as you said, if you have the environment to allow that entrepreneurship and the regulations to make us able to live in a decent environment, I think those are fully sympathetic.
We actually had a question up there from Andreas Kruger, if you can put the question back up there, which was directly to this point, that isn't the energy transition one of the ways we can generate more jobs and that the German experience, Andreas would suggest that that's the case. There may be some Germans here who disagree with that. I don't know. I know it's a controversial issue in Germany. But shouldn't we focus, this is a way actually to combine a solution to two problems. We have an energy problem, three problems. We have a carbon in the air problem, and we have a jobs problem. Shouldn't we pursue an energy transition across Europe and the United States to begin to address this? Anybody have a response to that assertion?
Well, I would say that the energy transition and what the European Commission Council just said they would do on Thursday, work within Europe to improve energy security, work to provide the pipelines and interconnectedness is really important. Of course, it's very political, and we know that in all of our societies, that it's great to have energy supply as long as it isn't as long as it doesn't affect your own backyard, and that's understandable.
But it drove up your electricity costs.
That's what I want to say. The energy transition, especially in Germany, is just increasing costs, tremendously increasing the cost, and there's no strategy up to date. How can we have cost-efficient energy supply for Europe in the future? And that's a huge issue after the political decision of stopping all the nuclear power plants.
Yeah. My friend Akiko Amai has a question up there, which is a broad societal question that it seems to me we need to address. And that is, don't corporations have a social responsibility in this time of very high unemployment to hire people not simply based on bottom line considerations, but especially those corporations that are sitting on so much capital? Don't they have a social responsibility to the stability of the system to hire more people? I'd be curious to get.
I'm very well prepared to do so.
Yes.
If you are prepared to educate the financial markets that a reduction of our return rates is acceptable to them.
They won't punish you for that. Yes.
So you go first and we go second.
A fair point, yes. We'll return to the audience for some more questions here. You got a question here. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Kale Agesi from TÜSİAD, the Turkish Business and Industry Association. My question is on the social psychology and the culture of work. couple years ago, a French politician campaigned in saying that people have to work more to earn more. Well, maybe the reality today is that people in the West, in societies, under the present circumstances of the global competition, have to work more and better in order to keep the actual earnings. But meanwhile, the revenue disparities have been becoming more and more problematic. Towards the 70s, the share by the top 10% of the society of the total income was diminishing, but in the last 10 years it is again increasing very, very dramatically. Probably not sending the good signals of motivation to the rest of the societies. So how to tackle with that what I would call in the necessity of a new culture of work in the Western societies?
A very good question, because one of the dramatic agreements across all societies, at least based on our surveys, my guess is Gallup has found the same thing, is that people everywhere believe that inequality is a big problem, they believe it's growing, and they blame the economic system for being unfair. That latter point is something that should worry all of us, even if you morally don't care about the other issues. And we have new IMF studies that argue that they see a link between rising inequality and slowing growth. So there is a demand side reason to narrow inequality. Should that be one of the policies we pursue to stimulate jobs? Caroline?
I think inequality or lack of opportunity is an enormous problem. I think it's one that's very hard to address just from governments. It's probably one that does go to long-term education, long-term ways to find people able to work with in companies and with apprenticeships. Obviously, there is a role for the tax and social safety net system, but I think there are limits in every society to how much you can change the distribution after the job. I think this is an important issue that every country needs to be working on.
I want the Republicans in the audience to know that was a Democrat who just said that. Okay, anyway, just question here, Jack.
Can I make one remark on his?
Oh, yeah, sure. No, Jim, go ahead.
I would answer this a little different way. Rather than worry about the unemployed, I think I'd worry about the employed youth. The reason I say that is because we're doing such a poor job with their development. So if you do a poll of European youth in the workplace, only 20% of them feel that they have meaning in their jobs and they feel good about it and all that. And that's pretty much what your life is. You sleep 8 hours, you work 8 or 10 hours or more, and whatever you do with the rest of it. But I've had the same job my whole life, by the way, but one of the most unbelievable correlates I've ever seen is if I ask you how your life's going, how your marriage is going, just whatever it is, it all comes back to your relationship with your boss. Mm-hmm. It explains almost all variation in life.
Yeah. Well, this actually is a very good. Could I interrupt you? We supposedly have a question from the young professionals downstairs. Do we have that somewhere?
But only 20% of young people feel that they're in a. And by the way, don't go after satisfaction. That's Mother Nature's trick. That you buy them a latte machine, you give them free lunch, and all that kind of stuff. What they really want, honest to God, is to be developed. But only about in Europe, it's about the same in Europe and the United States. It's only about 20% of the youth feel they're in a real developmental environment, and that's a bad. The culture, the right culture to have is a developmental culture, not a satisfaction culture. But we got to do a lot better. If we did a better job with the youth we have now, there'd be more jobs because we grow more. Everything would grow more.
Like I said, I thought we were going to get a question from the young professionals downstairs. I guess we did not get that, but it's my understanding that was the question they thought would come up in the group downstairs, is that we all have jobs. The 100 or so young professionals downstairs have jobs. What their concern was that those jobs have no no trajectory. They are going to be stuck in these kind of they're quite pleased they have jobs, but their income prospects are not that great. Their leadership prospects are not that great. And that, as you say, is very frustrating, unfulfilling, and I think it's.
But it's not the economy. If you have a bad boss, you are stuck. Your career is stuck.
Yeah. And your full potential as a human being and your ability to contribute to society is limited as a result, just as if someone's unemployed, and it's going to be limited.
But if you have a bad boss and you're in a thriving economy, you don't feel stuck with that boss because you can go and find another job. I think that's partly why a lot of the dissatisfaction comes back to the unemployment, underemployment, and a lack of vitality in the economy in Europe and in the United States, which I believe will gradually change, but is certainly still an issue now.
I wanted to bring back Jack Janes from German Studies in Washington. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Porth, about your experience. You seem to indicate that exporting the training system to other countries might run into some cultural problems. I wonder if you could zero in on the United States on that, because there's a lot of focus on this system in the United States. Just last Wednesday, there was a Business Roundtable meeting in which I think Eric Spiegel from Siemens held forth on how they're trying to do what they're doing in the United States with the German model. If you could explain one thing about the obstacles that you run into in the United States with trying to do that. I know you're doing it, Volkswagen's doing it, in other countries. And Caroline, one of the things that I worry about in that respect is the fact that you have investment in school systems, but we still have a major dropout rate problem. And Obama, as you well know, was simply, I think about 3 months ago in New York, investing a lot of money in the charter school system that IBM is starting up. What's wrong with our school system? Because I think that's going to be an answer that I'm going to hear from Mr. Porth.
Okay, Wilfried first. And I would sharpen that question. We've known about the success of the German model now for a couple of decades at least in the United States. To go to Jack's point, why in the world isn't every company in the United States, why, when you talk to people, why do they resist?
There are two major reasons, and I try to address them. The first one is, if you invest in such kind of apprenticeship, you want a formal graduation afterwards. And in the US, you only find formal graduations for universities or for business schools and so on. But in this apprenticeship surrounding, you don't have a formal graduation. Which is a value for itself, and there's no value in the society about such kind of a graduation. And the second one is that the people who go there, in the US, they have the option to go for training and for a quick job, and they get decent money there, and they're all happy. But if you go for apprenticeship, you get much less money in the beginning because you're not a productive person. You're investing in yourself. We are investing, and this is why young people tend to go for the job. This is actually why in Germany we have actually the discussion at the moment about the minimum wage to have some exclusions, because if we put the minimum wage for younger people also in fact, then they might tend to go directly into jobs and not invest in their education. So I would say those are the two main reasons for the
Caroline,
acceptance.
very briefly on education, because we have to close and we've got one last other thing we've got to do, but on education in the U.S.
Clearly that's a major area of challenge. Clearly we need to look at the whole range of education from pre-K through developing different ways to see what works. And the research rather tantalizingly shows that it is good teaching that matters most. So I think that's where we need to be focusing.
I might point out to our European audience that 30 years ago we did a study on the failings of the U.S. education system, and we could probably do the same study again. We'd find different failings, but it's an issue that we're still wrestling with and we haven't found an answer to. We're going to bring you all in one last time at the end of this with another survey of you. So if you could put that survey up there on the screen somewhere. There we go. Clearly, in the best of all possible worlds, the government and the society would do multiple things. This is a multifaceted problem, and we should be doing 17 things at once. The reality is societies and governments, even corporations, often can't walk and chew gum at the same time. So we're asking you to say, in terms of your priority, if there was an initiative that was the most important, you think, to deal with this single initiative, is it invest in and raise standards for education? Is it reduce deficits, cut taxes to spur investment in consumer spending, create more public-funded apprenticeships programs, set up large-scale infrastructure investment, or deregulate the labor economy? What would you tell people should be the primary, the top focus? You have 15 seconds.
Number 4 will.
What about increase the deficit?
So hopefully we'll get some votes out of this. We'll see where everybody
Cut
is.
taxes.
Interesting. Education, education, education, maybe secondary on the labor markets. That is a fascinating, that I will tell you is contradictory to what you said at the beginning. That's a supply side solution, and you all, a majority of you said what we should do is demand side things. I think that's fascinating. It shows how complex this is. I would like to thank our panel. I would like to thank our initial speaker. I'd like to thank you for a very stimulating conversation. Thank you.